Hello, this is Professor Keith Ross from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in a continuing series of video lectures for the Introduction to Criminal Justice course. This video lecture will be Chapter 11, which is prisons. And what we're really going to be talking about today is the actual brick and mortar institutions, as well as what comprises. So the differences between the appearance and reality of prisons shows an ambivalence about what prison is and what it should be. Really, the truth of the matter is, unless you have either been there, worked there, or know someone in there on either side of that jail gate, most people are informed about incarceration by what they see on TV, usually dramas and things of that nature. And truly, the reality is not what we see on TV. So that's one of the things that we need to consider. Less eligibility. Most people think that prisoners should live in conditions less desirable than even the worst conditions in free society. That if you've committed a crime and you've been convicted of that crime, you should serve your time. The issue here is that we still have to apply constitutional standards to everything. In the beginning of this semester, we really focused on police and that side of law enforcement, and we were really in the area of the Fourth Amendment. Then when we got to courts, we did talk about the Fourth Amendment, but we also talked about the Fifth and the Sixth Amendment with some partial discussions of the Eighth Amendment. Really, when we're talking about the correctional side of the criminal justice system, what we're talking about and what we really need to examine is the Eighth Amendment. So this issue here is that we want prisoners to be in conditions worse than the worst of society. However, we have to balance that with the idea of cruel and unusual punishment. That we are a humane society, and even if you have been convicted of a crime and you've been sentenced for that crime and we're in a prison, there still has to be some sort of humanity. So that's going to be one of the things that we're going to be discussing. Prisons as total institutions. For those that have, again, no real firsthand knowledge of jails or prisons, when we think of jails and prisons, what do we think about? Well, what we think about is the fact that we are putting them behind a gate. We're locking them up, we're locking them away, and we're throwing away the key. However, that is really not the reality of today's incarceration system. They are total institutions, meaning that, yes, there is a security function, but there is also this idea, one of the goals of corrections is this idea of rehabilitating. But the thought process behind the whole criminal justice system is that we want to make people exit better than when they entered, regardless of the fact, regardless of whether we're talking about victims or regardless of we're talking about offenders. So this is a thing that we will be talking about. Everyone is treated alike. Activities are tightly scheduled. Environments are closed off from the outside world. So for the most part, although the tide is starting to change with this too, if you have been convicted of a crime and you have been sentenced to jail, sentenced to prison, and I might even think about what's the difference between being sentenced to jail and sentenced to prison. Jail's misdemeanors and lower, prison's felonies. But regardless, when you're in prison, you don't get an individual TV. There might be a rec room that has TV and cable, like in Rikers Island, at least in some of the detention facilities there. You're not allowed a personal cell phone. However, that tide is changing. More and more jails and more municipalities are allowing inmates to have their own personal cell phones. Now, that's an issue that can be examined as to some of the positive aspects and some of the negative aspects. for this lecture, we're not going to really sort of discuss what that impact is, but it is something to consider. It might be something interesting for those of you that are interested in furthering your correctional studies. People are divided into two groups. There are those who control, and there are those who are controlled. So you have your predators and you have your prey. One way to look at it, you have the people that are in charge and the people that are subservient to those that are in charge. Now, this concept works on different levels because the standard thinking is, well, you have corrections officers. They exercise control over inmates. But are there groups or factions of inmates that exert control over other groups and factions of inmates? Again, something to consider. Classifications of prisoners. Not every prisoner, not every inmate is the same, and there are a lot of different factors. This classification system determines the type of custody and treatment appropriate to an inmate's needs. So things like age. Now, when we're talking about age, and we'll talk about it a little bit later in this lesson, the older a person gets, the more that they might require certain things. Maybe physical medical examination, something to that effect. Maybe they get medication that has to be dispensed on a day-to-day basis. The severity of the offense. Now, if we're talking prisons and we're talking people convicted of felonies, a felony is a felony, but there are differences between quote-unquote nonviolent felonies as opposed to violent felonies. And even when we're talking about violent felonies, there is a spectrum or a range that we can consider. Prior record. If there is a prior record or if there is a propensity for violence of this inmate, of this individual, that might work to garner a higher security classification for that person. One of the interesting sort of dynamics or classification types now is the sex. Generally speaking, traditionally speaking, jails, prisons are sort of broken up into into male, biological male, and biological female institutions. Well, now, in the last 20, 30, 40 years, there is a zeitgeist throughout society that talks about this idea of gender identification. One of the issues in the modern day correctional system is to determine, how do I classify someone that might be biologically one sex but identifies as the other? Where do they get placed? There have been a couple of cases regarding this, one in New York particularly, about, I believe it was a trans woman. I don't remember the case off the top of my head, but it's an issue that's going to actually need to be dealt with. The changing prison population. The number of prisoners has skyrocketed since 2000. However, this number has been declining since 2014, and specifically in bigger municipalities, and I'm thinking of the one we're in, New York right now, with this idea of bail reform, the numbers are decreasing and decreasing, for better or worse. That again is another sociological issue that we have to deal with. Really, this is more just information. So, largely due to drug enforcement policies on the federal level, were these inmate populations increasing. The United States is the world's #1 incarcerator, and the type of inmate is changing. That the sort of profile is that they are young, they are male, they tend to be more violent, and nearly 50% of them have been charged with some type of violent crime. One of the reasons why the prison population numbers are decreasing is because it's one thing to say, yeah, lock them up and throw away the key, until you're presented with that price tag. Now, in our textbook, if you looked at that graph, the cost to house one prisoner, one inmate per year, goes anywhere from $20,000 to about $60,000, $65,000. I believe in New York State, that number is about $62,000 to $63,000 per year per inmate. The interesting thing, and the New York Times had published an article a few years ago about that, is that really a true number? Well, it's a true number when we're talking about spending money directly on the inmate. Things like food, medicine, physical health treatment, mental health treatment, laundry, things of that nature. But it doesn't really figure in personnel costs. Costs like the corrections officer's salary that has to watch over the inmate, the social workers, the medical staff, things of that nature. That number can escalate to about $120,000 to $140,000 per year per inmate. Well, it has to be paid some way. So this is another reason why we consider the idea of decreasing jail populations. Prisons are overcrowded. In the book, it says 37% on the federal level, 8% on the state level. This is due to strict laws and the strict sentencing guidelines that are imposed on judges. But again, when you start overcrowding jails, that Eighth Amendment starts creeping in, this idea of cruel and unusual punishment, that you have to be able to house this inmate in sort of a humane way, at least too close to the level of the worst of society. Crowding plus a slumping economy, which is not the case today. The economy has been steadily increasing since about 2010. But this idea of we have to pay this much money per inmate per year, well, how do we pay for it? Well, more often than not, that gets paid through tax dollars. And then what happens is the more inmates you have, the more it costs, the more taxes have to be raised. Eventually, working people start saying, you're taking too much money out of my pocket. You need to do something about this. So again, prison programs, we're talking about this concept that they are total institutions. And this concept is housed in the fact that although an offender enters into a jail, enters into prison, when they have, quote unquote, paid their debt to society, when they are ready to leave, when they have finished out their sentence, regardless of whether it's parole or a completed sentence, we want them to be better than when they entered, and we want them now to be productive members of society. Now, if we want them to be productive members of society, we have to try and give them skills and things of that nature so that they can thrive on the outside. Because if we just lock them up and throw away the key and then eventually leave them, well, what's going to happen? It's just going to be a downward spiral. They're going to do the same thing over and over again. And again, we're talking about cost. The nature and extent varies among institutions. Some institutions are more geared towards this idea of rehabilitation. Some are more geared towards a security function. Now, when we're talking about prisons, there are minimum security, medium security, maximum security, and then supermax facilities. Obviously, when we're talking about a supermax facility, the inmate is housed in an individual cell about 8 to 10, 23 hours a day. So there's not much rehabilitation going on there. It is more about retribution, more about incapacitation. But there's also another issue to think about when we're talking about this idea of the total institution is how much money is available? How much money is allotted in municipal budgets, in state budgets, and maybe even in federal budgets for each individual institution? The sex and or gender of that institution and the people housed in there, age, security level, health needs, whether we're talking physical health needs or mental health needs. Now, when we're talking about mental health needs, one of the statistics that is usually thrown around is that 1 in 5 people in the United States of America have some sort of mental health issue. This does not mean that they need to be medicated, they need to be housed in some sort of mental institution or things of that nature, but something as maybe quote unquote benign, and I don't mean to make this uh, a low thing, but just maybe general anxiety about specific issues up until major mental illnesses. So if 1 in 5 have some sort of mental concern, mental stress, mental issue, that needs to be addressed because these things can magnify in a correctional type institution. Most prisons provide some degree of counseling and treatment. These can be things like reality therapy, where we talk one-on-one about an individual's behavior, group psychology, where people with issues are sort of confronted in a group of basically their peers in order to deal with and correct behavior. And behavior therapy, which is sort of a rewards and punishment, that if you do good, you'll be rewarded. If you do bad, you will be punished. Health and medical services. 1 in 5 inmates needs some type of medical service. Again, whether we're talking physical, whether we're talking health. This could be mental health issues, maybe counseling, maybe psychotropic medication. This could also be a person who has high blood pressure that needs to take some sort of medication to combat that. Maybe diabetes. Maybe this person needs to shoot insulin once or twice a day. Heart issues could be lots of different things. Prison facilities are like small clinics to handle daily routine medical needs. A prison clinic can, let's say, inject insulin, can give flu shots. However, if an inmate has a serious illness, a serious injury, or something that necessitates surgery, they will have to be transported to a local community hospital. I sort of like to think about prison clinics, sort of like urgent care. Like if you have something that's sort of easily solved, I have a really bad cold, I need a prescription for antibiotics or something like that. You can get that in an urgent care. However, if I need open heart surgery, you're not going to be able to do that in urgent care. That would be something much more serious, and you would need an actual medical institution to deal with that. Academic and vocational educations. 90% of the prisons in the United States of America have some form of either academic education enhancement or vocational education enhancement. Some of the figures that we're talking about here is that 2/3 of inmates have not finished high school. 1/3 of men and over 50% of women were not employed at the time that they were arrested, nor at the time that they were convicted and sentenced. Well, again, what are we thinking about? We're thinking about that we want this person that has quote unquote served their debt to society to be a productive member of society. So we want them to get a job. We want them to pay taxes. We want them to support themselves. We want them to live on their own. Well, in order to do that, you need some skills. So if you don't have a high school diploma, you can get one. You can get a GED while you are incarcerated, while you are serving out a sentence. If you have a high school diploma, you can pursue an associate's degree. If you have an associate's degree, you can pursue a bachelor's degree. If you have a bachelor's degree, you can take a course inside jail to prep for the GRE or to prep for the LSATs. And you can go to advanced educational studies, things like law school, things like pursuing some sort of other master's degree. You can even get a PhD in prison. It's sort of an interesting thing. Some people start thinking, well, why do they have access to this? Well, if we don't, what happens when they are released? Again, we are a humane society and we have to consider the whole of society, that we're letting these people out because they've served their debt to society. We want them to what? We want them to join society. So this is sort of a humane sort of dealing with that issue. Prison industries. Nearly half of all state and federal inmates are assigned to maintaining the facilities. I think I've discussed this in class that prior to me becoming a police officer, I worked on Rikers Island as a drug counselor in the detention facility. It wasn't a sentence jail. There were a couple of people that were sentenced and due to low security would be housed in 73. However, most of them were detainees, meaning that they were awaiting trial or they were awaiting sentencing. Well, in order for any sort of jail or prison to function, we need things to happen. The facility needs to be cleaned. The bathrooms need to be cleaned. The hallways need to be cleaned. The cells need to be cleaned. If there are dormitories, they need to be cleaned. People need to eat. The inmates need to eat. Things like this. These services are provided by inmates. It was one of the interesting things that when I worked in 73, there was a cafeteria there, and every day I could eat there, and I did. And who made or who prepped all these meals? Well, it was the inmates. 20% are assigned to these prison industries. They do things like laundering the clothes of the inmates. They're not doing corrections officers or things like that. Again, providing food, providing sanitation and cleaning the facility. There are also things like, depending on where the prison is housed, we can use these prisoners to work on farmlands. We can use these prisoners to clean up highways. We can use these prisoners to manufacture license plates. So if you look at your car and you look at your license plate, you know someone upstate in New York made your license plate. Road signs, things of that nature. One of the issues that people really have when they talk about jails and prisons, if they are a quote unquote law and order person, is this idea of recreation. That, well, they've been sentenced. They're bad people, so we should treat them bad. Well, maybe that's true, but maybe on the other side of this coin is that eventually everybody gets to a boiling point. And when you get to that boiling point, that needs to be expressed out. Now, how do you express that anger? Some people know how to express their anger in healthy ways. Other people do not. Now, if these inmates are getting to the point where they're about to blow their lid, well, who do you think they're going to blow it on? Well, they're probably either going to blow it on either another inmate or staff. And that can be corrections officers, that could be social workers, counselors, things of that nature. So you want to provide this idea of recreation to prevent stress, to prevent tension, to prevent anxiety. Also, one of these ideas about recreation is to improve self-esteem, to improve team building. Maybe the simple act of playing a basketball game, as silly as that might sound to some, this is a team building exercise. Not only you don't play a basketball game with one person, it's always a team. Also, this improves the health and fitness of the inmates. And usually what they say, a healthy body, healthy mind. And it's a way to channel energy in a more positive and a more creative way, as opposed to some of these more negative ways. Skipping to slide number 16, managing prisons. The four main goals of corrections staff: to provide for the security of the community by incarcerating those who break the law. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about this idea of incapacitation and retribution as one of the goals of corrections. Promote the smooth and effective functioning of the institution. Ensure that incarceration is secure. There's our security, but humane. Because no matter what, we're protecting society from these bad people, but these bad people have to be treated in accordance with the Constitution. The Eighth Amendment does apply. Give inmates the opportunity to develop a positive lifestyle while incarcerated and to gain personal skills, employment skills, educational skills, vocational skills they need for a positive lifestyle after release. Prison personnel. So we're talking about the people that work in the prison system. Prisons are managed as a hierarchy. There is a warden. The warden is the executive. The warden is the person, he or she basically runs the institution, runs the facility. Then we have two types of personnel. We have line personnel and staff personnel. It's sort of easy. Line personnel have direct contact with inmates. Personnel like corrections officers and supervisory staff of the corrections officers, counselors, health professionals, whether we're talking physical health or mental health providers, people that talk to inmates, people that are in contact with inmates on a day-to-day basis. And then we have staff personnel. These are normally people that perform an administrative function inside the institution, but there is no contact between this staff and inmates. 2/3 of prison employees are correctional staff or line personnel. Correctional officers have the most access to and potential influence over inmates. I've been lucky enough to have taught corrections recruits. And again, if you don't have much knowledge about what a correction officer does, most people, when they think of correction officers, what do they think of? Well, they're jail security. That's what they do. All they do is make sure everybody is safe. They're secure, they're behind bars, all of that. Nothing could be further from the truth. Just like everyone thinks all police officers do is lock people up and write summonses, corrections officers sort of serve the same function. As a corrections officer, not only are you jail security, yes, that's part of your job, but you're also a psychologist, you're also a counselor, you're also a referrer of various services. You can, depending on the person and depending on the inmate correction officer relationship, could be a mentor, could be someone that's a positive influence. So there's a wide variety of formal functions, periodic head counts 2 to 3 times a day, searches. When we're talking about searches, we're talking about searches of individual cells or searches of dormitories. And what are they looking for? They're looking for things that are prohibited, quote unquote contraband. These could be weapons, these could be illegal substances, things of that nature. Processing inmates, to the sort of intake process from sentencing to whatever jail or prison that person lands into, patrolling the institution, supervising inmates in work assignments, transporting inmates. Well, where are we transporting them? Well, we're probably more often than not, we're transporting inmates from the incarceration institution either to some sort of hospital or probably more often than not to courts. Enforce rules, investigate violations, and they will also sit on disciplinary hearing committees. As I said before, corrections officers, most people that have no knowledge of what COs do, tend to think of them just as jail security, that's the only function. That basically what they do is they stand around and watch inmates all day. Again, nothing could be further from the truth. They interact with inmates on a day-to-day basis. So they do act like psychiatrists. They protect weaker inmates from the more predatory type inmates. And they refer services, things like health services, physical and or mental, work assignments, things of that nature. I put slide number 21 just so you guys could understand. The New York City Corrections Department has a rank structure similar to what the New York City Police Department has. So I just wanted you to see on the bottom rung the rank and file of the Corrections Department are corrections officers. Now, if you take a promotional exam and pass it, you will go up to the second rank. Now, in the NYPD, that rank is called sergeant. In the Corrections Department, that is called captain. After that, we have ADWs, assistant deputy wardens, then wardens, and then you have executive staff, and this executive staff exercises control over all of the institutions, not just one specific institution. If we have a warden, that warden exercises control over one institution. Like on Rikers Island, there are different jails all over Rikers Island. There is a warden assigned to each and every one of those institutions. However, this executive staff, and what we're talking about here is assistant chiefs, deputy chiefs, the chief of department, and the commissioner, they exercise control. They make decisions for the whole. All of, let's say, Rikers Island, let's say the borough houses where central booking is housed, things of that nature. Gender-related issues, male prisons. Female corrections officers are often seen as more vulnerable to assaults and or manipulation. There is also, that could be, that's what the book asserts. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. I actually tried to look up sort of statistics on that. I couldn't really find anything that was really sort of compelling or probative to this discussion, so I'm not going to really quote anything to you there. However, there are times, just as with female police officers, there sometimes tends to be a connection where maybe there's a rub where it's male on male, where maybe a female might be a more effective communicator. This also very well works in a correctional setting as well, where maybe a female corrections officer might be able to develop a rapport with an inmate, whereas her male counterpart could not. Male officers have the majority of line of duty deaths and line of duty injuries in male prisons. A political article that I looked up talked about violence in these institutions, and when we're talking about Rikers, in the last 4 or 5 years, inmate to inmate violence has increased 70%. Inmate to staff violence, that means violence perpetrated by an inmate on a staff member, more often than not corrections officers, but could be somebody else, has increased about 12 to 13%. On the flip side of that coin, staff violence, the use of force, whether reasonable or not, has increased to inmates 30%. Well, if we're talking that inmates are becoming more violent, it's sort of another issue that could be brought up at a later date as to, well, how do you combat these violent inmates? Does violence beget more violence? Something to consider. Maintaining discipline. More than half of all inmates are charged with violating prison rules at least once. 1/3 of them commit multiple infractions. Younger ages, shorter sentences, gang affiliations, prior incarcerations are predictive of people that will violate the rules. The disciplinary process outlined the steps administration must follow in the disciplinary process. Now, we're talking about administrative hearings, we're talking administrative courts. We are not talking criminal courts, we are not even talking about civil courts. Now, one of the issues that it's really starting to be confronted in the last couple of years is that if you have been convicted of a felony, you have constitutional protections. However, you don't have all of the constitutional protections availed to a free member of society. Here's one. You have free members of society, you and I, we have the right to vote. Well, if you are convicted of a felony, if you are sentenced in an incarceration institution, you do not, as of right now, have the right to vote. This is something else that might be changing. Who knows? But again, we're talking about administrative courts. We're not talking about violating a law. We're talking about violating procedure. We're talking about violating the rules of the institution. So these are not courts of law. So there is no right. There's no Sixth Amendment right to counsel. There is also no Sixth Amendment right to confront witnesses, to cross-examine witnesses, However, you do have the Sixth Amendment right to obtain a witness in your favor. The disciplinary hearing informs the inmate of the charge of how they violated some sort of procedure, some sort of rule of that institution, gives the inmate, the person who wrote the incident report, opportunities to testify regarding the incident. So let's say a corrections officer sees a violation of some sort of rule. What's going to happen is that this process is going to take place where the corrections officer is going to give the NIATWI, the when, where, what, how, who, and why of what he or she observed and why he wrote up this disciplinary procedure. The inmate does have the right to testify as to either why he or she didn't do it or why he or she was justified in doing so, that maybe there was no other option available. Most correctional systems do allow appeal. So you write the report, there's the formal hearing, you can call witnesses on your own behalf if you are the inmate. Staff can also assist this inmate. Let's say there are literacy issues. Sanctions or punishments for violating the rules. So let's say you are found guilty in this disciplinary process. There's this idea of administrative segregation. So let's say you are housed in a dormitory with, let's say I worked in a dormitory. There were 6 dormitories. Each dormitory housed 50 men. Well, if you violated the rules, what would happen is you would leave for whatever the sentencing called for, 10 days, 30 days, whatever the case may be, and be put segregated administratively into, let's say, a personal cell. Now, if people tend to be social creatures, people want social interaction. So this is a sanction, this is a punishment that, I want social interaction, and now because I broke the rules, I won't get that social interaction, some sort of behavioral therapy. Loss of good time. So the better or more behaved that an inmate is, the more likely that their sentence will be reduced. Well, any time that these rules are violated and they are found guilty of the disciplinary process, they lose that chance of good time. And they also lose their chance of privileges, the privilege to work. Well, why does that sound like it's a privilege? Well, if you are a prisoner and you work, you make money. Well, I'm in jail. What can I do with money? Well, there are parts of the jail called a commissary. And in the commissary, you can buy creature comforts there. So let's say you hate eating, I don't know, baked chicken, and that's what was served at dinner. Well, if you have money, you get a chance to go to commissary, and there are things there. Let's say ramen noodles. I'm just picking that out of a crowd. I like ramen noodles, so guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to buy ramen noodles, and that'll be my dinner. Things like clean socks. There's a whole bunch of things, and it's detailed in the textbook. If you're found guilty, another privilege, visitation. So your spouse, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, whomever, family won't be allowed to go see you because you won't be able to see them because you are segregated administratively. You won't be able to receive mail. You won't be able to go to recreation, things of that nature. We're going to talk about now sort of different populations of inmates within these institutions. So inmates with HIV and or AIDS, well, they are to deal with this deadly disease is a very expensive proposition. So the cost of special medical care, we're talking getting the cocktail, it's a whole bunch of different drugs that interact with each other that help to try and stave off the HIV virus. Privacy rights, because even though I might have HIV, I might not want anybody to know that. And there are laws in place that protect my medical information, that I have the right to privacy over that medical information. Another issue with inmates that have HIV is the potential spread of HIV or AIDS and the security of the staff. Inmates with mental health problems, at least 16% are classified as mentally ill. That could be a number. As we start understanding mental illness better and better, my sense is that that number increases probably to like 20-25%, probably closer to the 20%. More have mental health problems requiring treatment. Treatment can be one-on-one counseling or group counseling, could be psychotropic medication, things that when we're talking about mental issues, we're really talking about is a chemical imbalance in the brain. So if we're talking about a chemical imbalance in a brain, basically what psychotropic medication does is that it corrects and balances that imbalance in the brain. So psychotropic medication, well, we need to, one, pay for that medication, and we also need to pay people to dispense it and administer it in a safe and practical manner. And why do we want to provide these mental health services? Because it controls violence, controls aggression against other inmates, against staff, and it also prevents suicide and suicidal thoughts. Most prisons provide mental health services as a matter of policy. And think about it this way. If someone was in physical pain, you would want that person to get treatment for the physical pain. Well, the same sort of applies for mental health, that if a person is in mental pain, you would want those issues to be addressed as well. Elderly inmates. Book says that this is the fastest growing population in state prisons. There could be many different sociological reasons for that. Could be sort of this idea of socioeconomic standards, that the divide between those that have and those that have not is starting to widen and widen. And eventually, people want to eat, people want things, and if they can't afford them, maybe they take them. It's an issue. It's something to think about. Costs 2 to 3 times more to incarcerate an elderly inmate than their younger counterparts, because there's a range of debilitating health conditions, increased vulnerability to predatory acts by other inmates. Some suggest age-segregated prisons due to health concerns. It's an issue, it's something to think about. Inmates with disabilities. 10% of inmates in state prisons have some sort of physical disability. This could be a cognitive disability, maybe that they don't have the quote-unquote normal intelligence quotient or the normal IQ, whatever, however you want to define normal. This, when we're talking about cognitive issues, we're probably talking about learning disabilities, things of that nature, or physical disabilities, things like the ability, someone who's blind, someone who is deaf, someone who is physically impaired, maybe wheelchair bound. Few prisons provide the needs for physically disabled inmates. However, in 1990, the ADA prohibits public accommodations from discriminating against persons with physical disabilities, meaning that incarceration institutions, jails, and/or prisons must provide some sort of appropriate and reasonable accommodation. And this idea of reasonable, we know, always goes back to the courts, has to provide this accommodation for these inmates. Juvenile offenders. When we're talking about juvenile offenders, a lot of people use the term juvenile offender and juvenile delinquent as an equivalent. They are not. Think of juvenile offenders as the worst of the worst. These juvenile offenders are children. The book says anywhere from 8 to 18. Let's use the number 13. Usually 13 is when the start, at least in New York State, that we start terming people juvenile offenders, that they've committed serious felonies, normally serious violent felonies. Most states will house juvenile inmates in general population, because a lot of times, depending on the age of the juvenile, they could be charged as an adult. It used to be in New York that if you were 16 years of age or over, you were charged as an adult. With the raise the age policy that has been enacted in New York State, that has changed to, I believe, 18 or 19. One of the things to consider on a sociological level is that if I'm charging an 18-year-old as an adult, Is that 18-year-old actually an adult? Well, studies have stated that a person is not fully formed, is still in adolescence well into their 20s. So it's sort of a disconnect in the criminal justice system, eventually something that's going to have to be dealt with. Female offenders, men are in prison at the rate 12 times faster than that of women. We talked about this in the last chapter, that women do tend to fare better at trial, and they do tend to fare better in sentencing. The numbers are increasing, but still few women are sentenced to prison. Women are more likely to be placed in smaller institutions, face less formal administration, have greater freedom of movement, and face less violence or intimidation by other inmates. Some more facts about female offenders. They tend to have shorter criminal records. However, that might be something that's changing. Some other statistics, typically 40% are survivors of some sort of abuse, either sexual abuse and or physical abuse. 59 to 70% are survivors of some sort of physical abuse or sexual abuse at childhood and or adolescence, and more often than not, at the hands of either a family member, a caregiver, or someone known to the victim. 75% are survivors of abuse by an intimate partner. When we talk about this concept of intimate partner, uh, does not necessarily mean a sexual relationship. It just means a relationship based on intimacy, a close relationship. And that's really the best definition I can give you. And if there is a question as to whether a relationship is intimate or not, if there is this idea of intimacy, that will be figured out in courts. Women inmates typically are less violent than their male counterparts. 36% of women are in prison for violent offenses versus 53% of men. The National Institute of Corrections conducted a study that concluded that women enter crime through pathways of abuse, poverty, and or substance abuse. 27% of women are in prison for drug offenses versus 18% for men. Women in prison in general need more social support than their male inmates. I'm not going to talk about this idea of surrogate families. What I would ask you to do is I provided a YouTube link. I'd like you to watch that link. It's sort of interesting how in women's prisons, in women's jails, what happens is these sort of surrogate family types start popping up, regardless of gender role, regardless of traditional male and or traditional female roles. One of the other issues to think about is this idea of mothers in prison, because normally when we're talking about the primary caregiver in a family, can be a father, but more often than not, it's usually going to be the mother. They're going to be the primary caregiver. Some statistics regarding that: 6.7% of African American females, 5% of Latinx females, and 5.2% of Caucasian females are pregnant at the time that they are incarcerated. Now, consider this: if they are pregnant at the time they are incarcerated in prison, at minimum, they're serving a year plus 1 day, which means they are going to give birth in prison or maybe transported out to a local hospital, but they're still sentenced and they're still incarcerated. Well, now we have issues because now we have to figure out, well, what do we do with the child? In approximately a 30-year span from 1991 to 2007, the rate of incarcerated mothers rose 122%. The rate of incarcerated fathers, 76%. In racial terms, it breaks down to 1 in 111 Caucasian women, 1 in 15 African American. To flip this statistic around, 1 in every 43 children has a parent who is currently incarcerated. Again, I provided another YouTube link talking about this idea of motherhood and incarceration. I would like you guys to check it out a little bit. I am going to skip to slide number 39, the Inmate Code. Informal norms that regulate inmate control. Now, beginning in this lecture, we talked about that in these institutions, they can be broken down into those that exercise control and those that are controlled. Well, now we're starting to talk about inmates who control versus inmates who are controlled. So, there is a code of conduct amongst inmates. Don't exploit other inmates. Don't lose your head while inside. Don't show weakness. Don't interfere with inmate interests. Don't be a quote unquote sucker. And don't snitch on other inmates to guards. Most inmates violate the code to some degree, but a blatant violation will lead to consequences, and this could range anywhere from being ostracized, which is the best of all possible punishments, to assault and or death. Gangs. Prison gangs. Gangs in prison develop for solidarity, power, and self-preservation. So, especially in Rikers Island, the three main gangs are Bloods, Crips, and the Latin Kings. That's not to say that there are not other gangs. There's definitely Russian mobs, Jamaican posse types, a lot of different Dominican gangs like the Trinitarios, etc., etc. Significant gang problems today in state and federal prisons. We don't really see it too much downstate in New York, but upstate and further throughout the United States of America. I've mentioned certain of these gangs, but then there are also the Caucasian gangs. Usually these gangs tend to be white power type gangs that segregate themselves by virtue of race. You can read the next couple of slides. I'm going to skip to slide number 46, prisoners' rights. Now, that almost sort of sounds like an oxymoron that, you've committed this crime, you don't have rights. However, there are some rights. So there are some loss of civil liberties, forfeiture from certain civil rights and privileges after a felony conviction. Last slide, 47, prisoners' rights. If I'm a prisoner, if I'm an inmate, I've been sentenced, I still have the right to practice a religion peacefully. So if I'm Jewish, I can practice Judaism. If I'm Christian, I can practice whatever Christian religion I practice. If I'm Muslim, I can practice Islam, things of that nature. The right to privacy. This is sort of an issue that probably will start presenting itself a little more. However, prisoners don't have much rights to privacy. If they have their own cell, they do not have the right to privacy inside that cell. They have been convicted of an offense. They are serving their time in that institution, but actually the state owns that institution. So the state can impinge on the individual's right to privacy. The right to mail and media. The individual institution can exert its control over mail, and they can read the mail prior to giving it to an inmate. An inmate does have the right, however, to access to court and legal services. Legal services, this could be anywhere from being able to talk to a lawyer, and a lot of institutions have their own law libraries. Now, we talked in a previous chapter about courts, talked about public appointed prosecutors, public appointed defense attorneys. They tend to have generally very, very large caseloads and can't really spend the amount of quality time necessary to maybe mount the most effective or possible defense. A lot of inmates will spend time in the law library researching their own case, and when they get to see their lawyer, will bring up certain things, maybe look into this, look into this, look into this. Protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Again, when we're talking about the correctional system, we're always going to be talking about the Eighth Amendment. The right to medical care. If someone has a physical malady, that needs to be treated. If someone has a mental malady, that needs to be treated. And prison conditions. What we're talking about here is balancing the security concerns of the institution versus the limited rights of the individual inmates. That is about all I have for this chapter. I wish you all the best. Have a good day, and next week we will conclude with Chapter 12. Take care.